Hey, tailgaters! Ross of the Pigskin Tales podcast here. Feel that summer heat? It's not just the sun, it's the thrill of upcoming college football season, stoking the coals. So get ready for the season. Dive into the history books with Homefield, the premium collegiate apparel brand from Indianapolis. Homefield crafts incredibly comfortable gear designed with iconic vintage nods over 150 colleges. A library of history right on your chest. Homefield is the Indiana Jones of collegiate apparel, uncovering hidden gems from school archives. Unique mascots, logos, and even unforgettable moments frozen in time. Visit homefieldapparel.com and shop the archives. Homefield Apparel, where comfort, nostalgia, and the spirit of college football history unite. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com.
It's Monday on Pigskin Dispatch, and we have our Collector's Corner where we talk about some great collections with the person that owns the collection and talk a little bit of football history about them. And today, we talk about the NFL 1962. It's all coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to another edition of Collector's Corner. We're trying to start off the beginning of each week with talking about some collections of football memorabilia, talking to some great collectors and getting some insight, and most of all, some great history from the stories that these pieces of memorabilia may tell about the players, teams, or whatever they may be. Maybe just an interesting story in all themselves. Today we have a little bit of all of that, other than the expert being a guest, because that expert will be me and a piece from my own collection. But before we get to that, let's make sure that we know something that we'd love to share with you each and every day, and that's our daily newsletter, as we tell you everything is going on in Pigpen, Pigskin Dispatch, Jersey Dispatch, Orville Mulligan Sports Writer, and many items from this Sports History Network as well. And we also like to give a little sports image of the day. Sometimes it pertains to somebody or the date that we're sending a newsletter out. Sometimes it's just an interesting piece, but every day you get a new image to look at and study and celebrate sports history. Now, it's so easy to sign up for our daily newsletter. You can go to the show notes of this very podcast or go to the top of pigskindispatch.com or jerseydispatch.com. Look for our free daily sports history and our logos up at the top with the little mail icon of the envelope, and we'll be glad to send it to you. You can cancel anytime. It's totally free, and every day 6:30 a.m. you will get a piece of history in your email inbox. Now, speaking of pieces of history, like I said, this is a piece of information, a piece of collection from my own personal collection that is kind of interesting. Something I just learned a lot more about recently of what exactly these things were. But back, let me tell you the whole story though. So back in my late teens, some 30 or 40 years ago, probably closer to the 40s side, my Aunt Darlene, who was an avid rummage and garage sale attendee, came to visit us. She lives out of state, comes and visits us, and she came bearing gifts of things that she would find at the garage sales and rummage sales that she had gone to. And she always knew that I loved football items, and so she one day came and visited one summer and handed me this manila envelope with writing all over it, and there were some NFL team names on it, and it says, there was photos, do not bend. It looked very official. There was an address on there and a name of a person I didn't recognize, and had the price that she had bought it at, I assume, at the garage sale. And so I opened it up and looked at it, and there was 14 color team photos of NFL teams. Now, it has a picture of the team. It's got a little picture of the logo of the era and all the names of the people that were shown in the photo of each one of the 14. Now, you look on the back, it's just plain white. There's nothing written on it. But you know what teams they are. You can see it says, Philadelphia Eagles and New York Giants and things like that. But not really knowing much more than that, I, looked at them and admired them. And, at the time in the 1980s, I didn't really recognize too many of the players or coaches on there because that was long before my era, before I was born, for goodness sakes. So I sort of put them in the envelope and sort of forgot about them, and would find them from time to time as I was going through some other stuff and put them with my football collections things. I sort of forgot about them until recently, talking a lot with these collectors and talking a lot of football, and I became really inspired talking to people like Jeff Payne and Show Dog and Joe Ziemba and all these great people that have these great collections, Greg Tranter, just some really cool things that are out there. And I said, wow, I have some of these things myself that are kind of interesting. Maybe I need to do a little bit more digging myself. So I did a little bit of investigation and found out these 14 photos were part of a promotion by Tang breakfast drink. Tang, back in the day, it was advertised as the drink of the astronauts. And, they showed, astronauts, I think like John Glenn and everything, they had them, in a space capsule drinking Tang and, mixing it up. And I think they literally sent it up with the astronauts when they were in space and during their moonwalks and everything, just to give them a little bit extra vitamins and some nutrition and a drink that was a powdered drink that you mix with water and, did it up much like you do Kool-Aid, and it was kind of cool. It was a great breakfast drink. Still a very good drink. I don't drink as much as I did when I was a kid, but it's still out there. And anyway, you could, I guess, cut a couple of proof of purchases. I'm not sure how many there were exactly. I couldn't really find that things, but let's say it's 2 or 3. And I saw the sum of 50 cents in the envelope. You send it into the whatever the address was, the Tang headquarters, and your General Foods was the main owner of Tang at the time. And back in the mail, you'd get this manila envelope like I got from my aunt and had these 14 pictures in it. So it led me to say, I need to do a little bit more investigation of these are from 1962. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the 1962 National Football League standings and see how these teams met. Remember, this is before the AFL-NFL merger, so there's only 14 teams in the National Football League in 1962. There was the AFL going on, which they had, I believe, 8 teams at the time, maybe 10. So, they were doing their own thing. This is only for the National Football League. So I went through and I said, I'm going to take a look at these things. So what I did is I scanned them. We have them on Pigskin Dispatch on this episode today. You can follow the link of the show notes and go to it. And I have all 14 of them displayed for everybody's enjoyment. And you can't see all of the names real clearly because it's a scanned image. But the rosters are very complete, including coaching staffs on there. Sometimes they have some of the managers on there as well. And we'll just take a look here at some of these teams, and we'll go in order of how they did. Now, back then in 1962, there was 2 divisions, I guess they were. I call them conferences, but let's say they're divisions, the Eastern and the West Conference. And I'm going to go in order of how these teams finished. Now, the Green Bay Packers finished at 13-1, and their team photo has just mostly players, and there's a few coaches on there, and it's sort of set. You can tell it's at Lambeau Field. You can see in the far distant right that there's a scoreboard from Lambeau Field at the time, and they're sitting around a bench, and it's a team photo. And they were the National Football League champs in 1962, as well as the Western champs under head coach Vince Lombardi. Remember, those are the 60s when the Packers were very dominant. They had legendary players like Bart Starr, Paul Hornig, Tom Moore, Jim Taylor, Ron Kramer, Jim Ringo, Jerry Kramer, Forrest Gregg, Bill Forrester, Willie Wood, Willie Davis, Max McGee, and so many others on this very star-studded roster. But they were the champs of that year. And then coming in second in the West Conference, we're at 11-3 were the Detroit Lions. Now on their roster, they were loaded with talent too, and their defensive coordinator was a guy by the name of Don Shula. Not sure if you ever heard of him. This is just a couple years before he took over the Baltimore Colts, led them to some great things, and then eventually the Miami Dolphins, and we know about the undefeated Dolphins 10 years after this, as Shula at the helm. They also had an assistant coach named Ray McClain, who was an interesting figure who ended up doing some great things in football as well. But players they had were legends like Yale Larry, Earl Morrall, Harley Sewell, Alex Karras, Roger Brown, Night Train Lane, Dick Night Train Lane, what a great player he was, Dick LeBeau, and Harlan Hill, and there were many more on there as well that you would recognize, but those are some of the big names from there. And following after them was the Chicago Bears of 9-5. George Halas was not only the owner, he was the coach at that time. He had coached them for a long, long time. Think about that, all the way back to 1920. And, he was the Decatur Staleys. He was a player coach. So he'd been around the bend a few times with the Chicago Bears organization. And they had legends like at coach, and one of the assistant coaches was George Allen. You got George Halas as the head coach, George Allen as an assistant coach. Can you imagine that? And then they had players like Mike Ditka, Billy Wade, Richie Pettibone, and Doug Atkins on the roster, and a lot more too. They were just a tremendous team. Following after them were the Baltimore Colts, and they were just a few years removed from a championship in the NFL, but they still had some big names on the roster in the team photo. Johnny Unitas was still their quarterback, Lenny Moore, Raymond Berry, Jim Parker, Gino Marchetti, Billy Ray Smith, Don Shinnick, Jerry Hill, and more, along with head coach Weeb Ewbank. We forget about him being the Baltimore Colts. We think more of the Baltimore Colts of Don Shula playing against Weeb Ewbank's New York Jets in Super Bowl #1, what we call it now. But Weeb Ewbank was definitely the coach of the Baltimore Colts. Matter of fact, that 58 championship game, a very famous one of the Giants and the Colts, Weeb Ewbank was the head coach of them then. So Weeb Ewbank was well established at that time. And the 1962 San Francisco 49ers came up right after them in the West, and they had assistant coaches on their squad like Jack Christensen and Bill Johnson. Their roster also had brilliant names like John Brody, Billy Kilmer, J.D. Smith, Jimmy Johnson, the player, not the one that coached the Dallas Cowboys eventually, but Jimmy Johnson, the College Hall of Fame player, Leo Nomolini, Charlie Kruger, Matt Hazelton, and Abe Woodson, and more on that roster. And the Minnesota Vikings, they were an NFL franchise in 1962. They were coached by the great Norm Van Brocklin as their head coach. Assistant was Harry Gilmer, and Fran Tarkington was on that roster, Tommy Mason, Mick Tingelhoff, Jim Marshall, and Mel Triplett, and many more on that roster as well for the Minnesota Vikings. And in the rear of that was the 1962 Los Angeles Rams and head coach Bob Waterfield. He had some brilliant names in football lore. Jack Pardee was on that roster, Deacon Jones, Roman Gabriel, Lamar Lundy, and Merlin Olsen, and many more there as well. Some very formidable teams and players were found there in the Western Division of the NFL in 1962. Now, the East had some very, very good teams as well. Now, in that Eastern Division, you had the New York Giants finishing at 12-2. They faced the Packers in the NFL Championship that year and lost to them. The Pittsburgh Steelers came in second at 9-5. Cleveland Browns were 7-6. The Redskins 5-7. Dallas Cowboys were 5-8 and 1. And St. Louis Cardinals were 4-9-1. And the Eagles were 3-10-1. Redskins had 2 ties, and so the Cleveland Browns had 1 tie. So that was a surprising thing to see the Steelers in second place in there, and we'll get to more of some of their players here in a moment. So going through the New York Giants, they had some great stars on that team, and that's why they were so good. Y.A. Tittle was a quarterback, Frank Gifford, one of the backs, Del Schaffner, Rosie Brown, Joe Walton, Alex Webster, Jim Katkavich, Rosie Greer, Andy Robustelli, Sam Huff, Jimmy Patton, and Dick Modzelewski, and more on there. The Steelers were second place there. Head coach Buddy Parker led his Steelers to one of their better records in franchise history up to that point, before the 1970s. Buster Ramsey was a defensive coordinator. The roster had some big-name players, too, like Ernie Stautner, John Henry Johnson, Bobby Lane, Buddy Dial, and Big Daddy Lipscomb were on there, and more. The Cleveland Browns were next, 1962, under the direction of head coach, Hall of Famer Paul Brown, And also on the coaching staff was Blanton Collier, who would be Brown's replacement and successor was the Browns head coach, and just a few years after that, Howard Brinker and Dick Evans were also on that coaching staff. The roster was loaded too with names like Jim Brown, Ray Renfro, Bill Glass, Paul Wiggins, Lou Groza, and Jimmy Ray Smith, and more. And then the Washington Redskins, they had some great assistant coaches on staff too. Ted Marchabroda and Ray Wilsey, as well as Abe Gibron, were on that staff. And on the roster, they had the talents of players like George Izzo, Gordon Kelly, Bobby Mitchell, Norm Snead, and Bob Pellegrini, and others. That brings us to the Dallas Cowboys, and it's weird to see the Cleveland Browns, Pittsburgh Steelers, Dallas Cowboys all in the same division with the Giants and the Washington Redskins, St. Louis Cardinals. But that's the way it was back in the NFL then. But the Cowboys, they were under head coach Tom Landry at the time, and they put up some magic. They were just starting to get that rhythm together and getting these players together. Don Meredith was their quarterback, Dandy Don, and Don Perkins, Bob Lilly, Chuck Howley, and Dick Nolan, and others filled out the roster of the Cowboys that season. The St. Louis Cardinals, they were in St. Louis, and they were a football team back then in 1962. They had a few star attractions on the roster as well. John David Crow, who we remember from the college game in his days at Bama. Sonny Randall, Larry Wilson, and Jimmy Hill were a few of the players that we may recognize today on that roster, but a lot of other stars on there. And the Philadelphia Eagles came in the rear, as we talked about, in the East. And 1962, they had stalwarts like Sonny Jurgensen, Tommy McDonald, Irv Cross, Jimmy Carr, Maxie Bond, and Concrete Charlie Chuck Bednarik, among others. Now, we can look back at these teams and say, that's some great stuff, and there's some great color photos, and we share them with you on Pigskin Dispatch for this day of 1962 NFL photos. You can put that in the search box, and or go follow the show notes right to the link to look at this exciting post that we have on today from my own personal collection. We're glad you could join us for this bit of football history. Hope you join us for more, because we have some great stuff coming up here. Some great authors coming on, experts, and more collectors, as well as some great football history that we did from our own research. So till next time, everybody, have a great football day. We're taking a peek over at the chains and the down marker. It's 4th and long. We're going to have to punt the ball and get on out of here, but we'll have another series tomorrow for your football history headlines, so be sure to tune in. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Jean Monroe, as well as Jason Neff, for letting us use their music during our podcast. Pigskindispatch.com is a proud affiliate of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, aka the Football History Dude, and I wanted to thank you for stopping by to listen to another episode here on the Sports History Network. Our podcasters are passionate about uncovering and sharing sports stories from yesteryear. And if you didn't know it already, we have over 30 shows across the network covering all sorts of sports history topics. In fact, here's a glimpse into one of our awesome podcasts here on the network.
Each week, the official Football Learning Academy podcast will take you deep into the history of pro football through interviews with players, coaches, or administrators in the NFL, as well as interviews with Pro Football Hall of Fame selectors, authors, and historians. You'll learn how the game evolved and important moments that shaped the sport into what it is today. And don't miss the Pro Football History Nugget of the Week. Listen to the official Football Learning Academy podcast on the Sports History Network.
How about that? I bet you're super hyped to go listen to that new podcast, right? Well, to learn about this show and all the other podcasts on the network, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcast. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/podcast. Head over there today to find your next favorite sports history podcast.